Today we're going to talk about the materials that make up the bulk of your speech, your supporting materials. They offer evidence for your arguments and provide clarification and understanding regarding your speech topic. Supporting materials are the bits of information and arguments that support the main points of your speech. They are the support you use to make your arguments seem reasonable to your audience. In this presentation, I'm going to go over some of the most common types of supporting materials, so make sure that you're familiar with and use a good mix of options available to you. Arguments are good ones. They can also be used to clarify your main points, to offer more specific examples, and to make your ideas more clear overall. Supporting materials help convince your audience that your arguments are probably true. It's not enough to just make claims without backing those claims up with good evidence. The more evidence you have and the better that evidence is, the better your chances of having an impact on your audience. Good supporting materials are crucial to your efforts to be persuasive and remembered. Decisions about supporting materials are often audience dependent. So for example, if you're an education major and you're giving a speech about some policy to other education majors, you may not need to offer any supporting materials that clarify that policy because your audience may already be well aware of it. But if you were giving a speech on the same topic to a general audience, you'd probably need to add some supporting materials that clarify the policy you're discussing. So think carefully about your audience and what ideas do and don't need support. There's nothing worse for you and your audience than wasting time giving them information that they don't need because you didn't consider your audience when deciding on your supporting materials, or not giving them enough information to make an informed decision or even fully understand your speech because you didn't think about your audience when deciding what supporting materials to use. One type of common supporting material is the example. You can have a lengthy example, even a type of story that gives people more information on a topic, or you can have brief examples, like a list of jobs students commonly get with a particular major. Whether you're using long examples or brief ones, you're clarifying something important for your audience. If you choose to use a story as supporting material, you need to remember a few things. First, remember that you need to tell stories without looking at your notes, which we've already talked about. Also remember that the stories need to be relevant to your topic. A story that's not terribly well linked to your topic won't do you any good and will confuse audiences. Don't put too much detail into stories. Keep it simple. The more you ask an audience to remember, the harder it is for them to remember the most important things that you've said. A type of supporting material that we're all familiar with is the statistic. Statistics show us how trends are numerical and can be very persuasive. Most audiences know, though, that statistics can be easily manipulated, and so many are distrustful of statistics. When you decide to use a stat, you have to be very careful about the stats that you use. To help eliminate concern about bias, look for the same statistic in a number of places. If you're talking about gun control, for example, don't just cite a statistic on gun violence from the NRA or a gun control organization. Get stats from those groups and also get a stat from a government database. Tell your audience that in your research you wanted to find the best information possible, so when you looked for the statistic you went to these 3 places. Chances are very, very good that these 3 places will have different numbers for the same statistic. So you can tell your audience that one organization had 65%, the other listed 50%, and the third listed 45%, so that we can estimate the answer is probably somewhere in the range of 45 to 65%. That way you tell your audience that you tried to avoid bias and tried to get them the best numbers possible. Using statistics that are biased are the easiest way to have an argument discredited, and the use of cell phones makes it too easy to find another statistic on the spot and embarrass you. Don't set yourself up for embarrassment. Use statistics fairly. Your book talks about other concerns with regard to stats, so make sure that you're aware of those potential pitfalls. Some other advice for using them is to not use too many, because your audience members will get the numbers mixed up, forgetting what statistic went to what argument. You should also round off statistics. So if the statistic is 53.4%, just say 53%. 53% is more likely to be remembered by your audience than 53.4%. Remember also that correlation doesn't equal cause and effect. So make sure that you don't represent something as cause and effect when that relationship hasn't been established by the statistic. You might also provide more meaning through comparison for your statistics. It may be hard for an audience to understand what certain percentage of the Gulf's coastline that was ruined because of an oil spill looks like. But if you can find out the amount of that coastline ruined is equal to the size of the state of Rhode Island, for example, that's something people can more easily comprehend. Statistics can be abstract, so make sure that you make them clear when you need to. Analogies are a type of supporting material that aren't used as often as they should be. The point of the analogy is to make something new more understandable to your audience by virtue of comparing the new thing with something they already know about. Analogies probably aren't used as much as they should be because for the most part people don't think of them naturally. Most of us have to expend energy and time to think about them. It's definitely worth the time and energy though, because they can help make unfamiliar things familiar to your audience in a very little amount of time. There are two types of analogies, figurative and literal. Figurative analogies compare two things that are distinctly different in terms of form but have something in common. So, for example, if you wanted to talk to people about how a Concorde jet flies, maybe you'd compare it to the steadfast and amazing flight of an American eagle. That way, the audience can take what it knows about what an eagle looks like flying and compare that to what a Concorde jet might look like flying. The second type of analogy is more common, and it's the literal analogy, which compares two things that are more similar. If I were to ask you to tell me something about the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan during the 1980s, could you tell me anything? Suppose I was doing an informative speech on the topic and I started off by saying, for those of you who don't know much about the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, it was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Then you'd probably have some idea about what happened, right? That's the power of an analogy. You went from knowing perhaps nothing about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to having some ideas about what happened with only a few sentences. So, when you're having trouble explaining something new to your audience, think about whether or not there's an analogy you can make that will serve as sort of a shortcut to help your audience immediately understand a little bit more about your topic. The next type of supporting material to consider is testimony. There are three types of testimony to think about. The first two types are experiences testimony and expert testimony. Often when people think about testimony, they think about experts, which is also a type of testimony you can use, but sometimes experiences testimony can be just as powerful. Think about doing a speech on drug addiction. You can use an expert in the field to give testimony about drug addiction, and it can be very useful. But you could also use testimony from someone who was actually once addicted to drugs, and they can talk about the topic in a very different and probably more emotional way. Both types of testimony are useful, with experiences testimony being useful for emotional appeal, and expert testimony being useful to deliver cold, hard facts or weigh in on some controversial element of a topic. The final type of testimony to think about is reluctant testimony. This is when you use the testimony of someone who isn't served well by that testimony. So, for instance, if you were doing a speech on some political policy that is supported by Senator X, but then you found a quote from 2 years earlier where the same senator is expressing an opinion counter to his or her current opinion, and there's no clear explanation as to why that opinion has changed, that might be something powerful to consider using. Think about any law shows you watch on TV. Reluctant testimony is an element that you sometimes see, with the idea being that if someone is forced to testify to or admit something that is against his or her immediate interest, that's a very powerful form of testimony. After all, it's easy to testify to things that will benefit us in some way, but if someone testifying to something that doesn't benefit him or her and even can hurt them, that's pretty powerful stuff. An offshoot of testimony is quotes, which are a type of testimony. You know what a quote is, so I won't go over that, but here are some rules to think about when using quotes. First, don't use long quotes. If the quote is over 3 or 4 sentences, paraphrase that quote and let the audience know that that's what you're doing. It saves you time and it eliminates long, boring quotes that many audiences may give up listening to before they're even over. If they're really short quotes, just like one short sentence and they're really powerful, maybe consider repeating the quote as a dramatic strategy that puts more emphasis on the quote itself. You also have to make sure that you quote correctly. Not quoting correctly isn't just a problem in terms of ethics, but it's also a problem in terms of legal issues. If you misquote someone and you harm their reputation by doing so, you could get sued. You need to make sure that you quote correctly. Remember that the power of a quote depends on who's saying it, so make sure that you also tell us who that person is, and if it's not somebody that we already know, give us that person's position so we can understand why it's important that we consider what he or she is saying. You need to also think about currency. Trust that when you get a bit older, you're not going to want to be bound by everything you believed and said out loud in your youth. People change and our ideas change as new experiences teach us new things. We see this a lot in politics. People will say take something that someone said 20 years ago or something they did 20 years ago and act as if it's relevant now. If the person obviously still holds the same beliefs, then it's relevant. But if the person hasn't shown any indication that he or she still believes what they said, then it's really not fair to bring up that old quote. Finally, remember not to take a quote out of context. A good example of this happened years ago when a group against affirmative action used the MLK quote, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Taken out of the context of the March on Washington, this quote seems to argue against affirmative action. But within the context of the whole "I Have a Dream" speech, there's no way anyone could ever argue that Martin Luther King would be against affirmative action. The group that took this quote out of context and used it for their anti-affirmative action campaign was sued by the King estate and they lost. So not only is taking a quote out of context unethical, it can also cost you in court. So that's it for types of supporting materials. Make sure that you read your book chapter on supporting materials for more ideas and tips.